despite all these challenges, I really think so much of the world counts on us, not just at the Department of State or USAID, but counts on Americans to play an active, engaged, and inspired role in the world. And I believe that's what we're doing today, and I believe that's what we should be doing in the years ahead.
Hello, WorldBoston. Greetings to our speakers, members of the Diplomatic Corps, and distinguished guests. I'm Mary Eintema, President and CEO of WorldBoston, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to the 7th annual State of the State Department program. As always, we thank the Lowell Institute, which helped found and generously supports the State of the State Department series, along with our Great Decisions and Chat and Chatter programs, which are now all free of charge to us. Thanks also to our production partner, GBH Forum Network. Thank you to the Boston Public Library, the oldest public library in the world, in the United States. I always like to point that out. Thanks to Harvard's Belfer Center for their cooperation. Thank you to my WorldBoston colleague, Harrison Zyberg, who is running the show tonight, and to all the WorldBoston staff and board members. Some reminders. As you may know, the mission of WorldBoston is to foster international engagement and global cooperation. So thank you for being part of that mission. Finally, our program. We have lots to cover, so I'll only read excerpts from our speakers' amazing biographies. Richard Verma has served as Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources since April 2023. In this role, he acts as the Chief Operating Officer of the department and leads the department's efforts on modernization, foreign assistance, and a wide range of workforce and strategic issues. Secretary Verma previously served as U.S. Ambassador to India, where he led one of the largest U.S. diplomatic missions and championed historic progress in bilateral ties. He's also former Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs and the former National Security Advisor to the Senate Majority Leader. Deputy Secretary Verma is a veteran of the U.S. Air Force and the recipient of numerous military and civilian awards, including the Meritorious Service Medal and the State Department's Distinguished Service Award. And I want to point out that Secretary Verma is no stranger in these parts, as prior to his current role, he was a senior fellow at the Belfer Center. And he's been here for a little bit on this trip because this morning he was in New Hampshire, among other things, presiding over a naturalization ceremony of new Americans, and that is just great. Monica Duffy-Toft is Academic Dean, Professor of International Politics, and Director of the Center for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School at Tufts. Before that, she taught at Oxford's Blavatnik School and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She spent 4 years in the U.S. Army as a Russian linguist. She recently co-authored a book that we actually featured at WorldBoston called Dying by the Sword, the Militarization of American Foreign Policy. Her research includes international security, ethnic and religious violence, civil wars, and demography. Thank you both so much for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Mary, and welcome everybody to this evening. I am so delighted and I'm honored, actually, Secretary, to have been asked to host this evening's event. And actually to have the privilege to have dinner with you tonight. So thank you so much. Sorry you all can't join us, but you can join us for this conversation, which I hope is lively. And we're going to start with global events and diplomacy. And today's June 25th, 2024, and it's actually a pretty remarkable day if you think about it historically. 79 years ago today, the United Nations Charter was signed in San Francisco. And this foundational treaty established the United Nations, and it set forth the principles and the structures of the organization that aim to promote international peace and cooperation for decades, including to today. 3 years later, tragically, was the start of the Berlin airlift, and I think that was sort of the real beginning of the Cold War. Which was when the Soviets blockaded West Berlin and Western allies began the airlift in 1948. A brief 2 years later, on June 25th, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, invading the South and started, it's still not ended, Korean War. And then on 25 June 1991, Slovenia declared its independence from the Yugoslav state. And I think you can argue that was the end of the Yugoslav state, and it brought war to Europe. So these events highlight, the diverse and impactful nature of this day in the context of global affairs spanning conflicts, international diplomacy, and significant geopolitical changes. But so much has changed, but so much has remained the same. So today, war rages in the Middle East and on the edge of Europe, and some would say in Europe, depending upon where you place Ukraine. China is pushing its weight around, while Russian President Putin is cozying up to North Korean leader Kim. New territories are opening and being contested, such as the Arctic and space itself. We now have to have diplomacy over space, much more so. All the while, old tactics of war are making a comeback, notably siege and famine, and I know you dealt with the Sudanese conflict most recently, and of course in Gaza and Yemen. And new technologies are emerging that are challenging the basic institutions of state with cyber attacks, deep fakes, we're seeing that in our own political elections here, and the changing nature of warfare. And I think most recently we witnessed that in Nagorno-Karabakh with the swarming of drones that allowed Azerbaijan to claim Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh as its own today. And of course, there are the global challenges of climate change and pandemics.
I'm getting depressed.
So
Through your list, yeah.
your job is to help us to think through all of these challenges, which some are old, some are new. And so how are you and your colleagues thinking about this incredibly complex world of diplomacy?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question and laying out the framework. Thank you to WorldBoston for inviting me here. It is great to be back in Boston, and I love coming here. And I will say I started the day, as you mentioned, with the most uplifting ceremony, welcoming dozens of new American citizens. And if you were just able to see the excitement and the nervousness and the hope of these new citizens, but their families, and just what this day means to them, it was just really special to be part of that. I told them my naturalization ceremony took place about 40 years ago, September 20th, 1985. I found my naturalization certificate the other day. It's a disturbing picture of myself, like something about hair in 1985 that was not so cool. But it was a great moment for me. I was able to kind of come full circle and tell them about why our family ended up here and how we ended up here, and how this American story is a really cool one. So that was a great way to start the day. What you laid out, obviously, is a very challenging situation. I've been in this job as Deputy Secretary for Management, coming up on about 16 months, maybe 15 months, my third position in the State Department. In that 15 months, I have been to 50 of our embassies and consulates. I have been kind of on the road nonstop. I fly tomorrow to Paraguay to the OAS summit, and I know there's not really a direct way to get from Boston to Paraguay. I've learned that. But I come back from my travel with a number of observations that track very closely with what you laid out. World is obviously a very dangerous place. My first trip was to Kyiv and to Ukraine, and then to Poland, Moldova. I kind of saw the kind of conflict up close and what our people were doing. I headed into the Indo-Pacific and saw this very intense competition with China. This is all preceding October 7th. Before that, we had 3 coups in Africa. We had to evacuate our embassy in Sudan. We then had the attacks of October 7th, the hostage situation, the humanitarian crisis, and then obviously the potential for broader regional conflict in the Middle East. And so great power competition, very much alive. The challenge posed by states like Iran and North Korea, very much front and center the challenges posed by terrorism, which this country knows all too well about, also front and center. What I have also seen are a set of problems that our director of the Central Intelligence Agency calls problems without passports. Problems that cannot be bombed into submission, that cannot be kind of intimidated, that can only be solved through international cooperation, pandemic response and global health security, cybersecurity, and the both pluses and minuses from these incredible advances in technology, the impacts of climate change, the impacts of migration and food insecurity. There are 125 million people displaced and on the move today. So you can look at this incredible array of challenges and, as I said, be very depressed and be very concerned. But I also come away from these trips, and I really mean this, I come away inspired by the team of people that we have around the world, our State Department people, our development people, our military professionals, our nonprofit and aid workers, our academics, our Americans are doing incredible things in different pockets of the world. And I look at some of the other trends. People are living longer. Development indicators are moving in the right direction. More people are being lifted out of poverty. More people are connected to the internet. You could argue the world is actually more democratic based on the fact that 60% of the world will vote this year in some sort of democratic election. Nearly 700 million people just voted in India over a 5-week period peacefully, and the results were not called into question. So you can have these two different views of the world, and they're both accurate. Now, the president and the secretary rightfully say we are at an inflection point because we could end up repeating a lot of the mistakes of the past, end up into kind of a deeper conflict, or we could have a more peaceful, democratic, prosperous future. And that is what the vision is, not only for us, but for our allies. So it is about deepening partnerships. It is about new architectures in the Indo-Pacific. It is about continuing to lift people up who are poverty-stricken. And it is the U.S. playing a leadership role. Because, again, as Secretary Blinken likes to say, the world will not organize itself. So we are thinking about all these challenges and thinking about, okay, so what kind of State Department do we need to respond to these challenges? Well, we need a lot of new expertise. We need people who are experts in data science. We need people who are climate scientists. We need people who come from medicine and can help deal with the next pandemic. And that's exactly what we've been working on, is trying to build up a lot of skill sets. We're trying to reinforce the basic diplomatic work that we know how to do. But we are working in new areas that hopefully address some of these threats. Now, we have our own challenges here at home, which is making sure we have the funding and the resources and the staffing to actually do that. But again, I come away actually, again, inspired by our people and more hopeful, but also clear-eyed about the threats and clear-eyed about what the U.S. has to do to address those threats. So long answer, but we are quite aware of the situation. Let me say one other thing, and that is a bit of a reckoning by countries who, in the last century, you mentioned the UN Charter, you mentioned the kind of post-war order, which we helped build. You know, their view is you built it, we appreciate it, but you also wrote the rules, and you kept us out of most of the ability to shape those rules. And they're saying in this century, that's not going to be the way it goes. So this is why we have a much more active and engaged India, South Africa, Brazil, Turkey, and our traditional allies like Japan and Korea and others saying it is time to have a more kind of inclusive international system. And there are some growing pains with that, but we welcome, frankly, the multilateral approach, but we're still playing a big and important role.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I'm glad you're optimistic, because I teach at the Fletcher School, and I know a couple of my colleagues are here, and we produce many students who are coming your way, right, to work in the State Department and, to hopefully make a positive change. And, when we teach them about conflict resolution, the way the global trade system works, the way the international system, global governance. They really want to get in and do this work and be some of those folks that you're coming home to or going and visiting when you go to the missions and the embassies and the consulates.
That'd be great. Well, honestly, we welcome them. I will say last year we had our biggest class of foreign service recruits that we've ever had. We had our biggest class of civil service hirings that we've ever had. And so there's incredible interest in people joining the Department of State, and that is a good thing for us, and the standards could not be higher. We could not have a more diverse workforce than we've ever had before. We are drawing from all 50 states. 20% of our workforce are veterans. So I'm really impressed about the quality of the people we have, but again, the kind of work that they're doing is super challenging and super hard.
Yeah, so you had already mentioned the budgets and sort of the personnel, some of the personnel issues. So I got interested in this area, and I think one of the reasons why I was asked to host this with you is I just finished a book on sort of the U.S. militarization of foreign policy. And so you can take that book literally and figuratively and throw it at people who are not giving you the proper budgets that you need for your agency.
You gave me permission to do that here.
I give you permission.
Okay.
I give you permission. I'm the one that said that. Okay. And what motivated me for that book were data points. It's a data book. And first, the State Department budget has never been more than 5.6% of the Department of Defense budget, which is just crazy, right? Because if you think about it, the State Department's everywhere. And now DOD is, by the way. And at the time, the U.S. had special operators operating in more states than it did ambassadors. I found that distressing, right? So the face of American power, American might, American values, right? Not that the special operators are bad people. They're doing important missions, but I think Americans would be stunned to have learned that. So this made me worry, as it did others, and notably, we can return to Secretary Jim Mattis, right? That very famous comment he made when President Trump's 2018 budget promised to add $54 billion to the defense budget while cutting the State Department budget by $54 billion, the same amount, which is practically the State Department budget. And Mattis decried, you understand, this is Secretary of Defense, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition ultimately. And that was before members of Congress at a National Advisory Council meeting. So the current State Department budget, some 6 years later, stands around $58 billion. It's a 6% reduction over 2023, but it's less than some wanted, that reduction. Congressional Republicans wanted it to be 15%, even lower than that. And it's still only 1% of the US federal budget.
Right.
And from the State Department's website, when it was founded, your department, with the first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. He had one chief clerk, 3 subordinate clerks, a translator, a messenger, and 2 diplomatic posts, one in London and one in Paris. And then 10 consular posts. 230 years later, you've got a workforce. You're in charge. You're the chief operating officer of this organization. 77,000 employees. Are you a good boss?
We're actually closer to 80,000.
Okay, so you have to update your webpage.
I know.
All right.
You should come work for us, actually. It's a big
13,000 members of the Foreign Service, so that's the professional corps, I guess. 11,000 civil service employees, and then you have 45,000 locals, right, that help out at the agencies. So, and then I also read that you're facing a personnel crisis, that you're 13% shy, generally speaking. Some departments are more than others. So, and I've seen you use the term that given the threats we face, the challenges, that the State Department should be seen, and I think this is good, as an arm of national security. Look, I study war and violence for a living, so for me that sounds good. But with the budget and the resource constraints, how are you managing?
Yeah, So you made me depressed again. This is not beer, by the way. This is
It's not.
no,
This is water.
This is water. Let me take a step back. Let me just outline kind of who we are and what we do. So we are actually about 80,000 people. We have about 270 locations around the world. Those are embassies and consulates mainly. We have 52,000 people who are locally employed staff. So the vast majority of our people are local hires at different embassies and consulates around the world who do an incredible job. We have about 14,000 foreign service officers, and we have about 14,000 civil servants. That makes up the kind of 80,000. Then we have a bunch of contractors. We have family members who are now doing a ton of work for us around the world. Our budget, yes, comes in around 58, 59 billion for a workforce of that size. We have a staffing gap on the civil service and foreign service side. Comes in about 13%, which is a concern. If you think, if United Airlines or Microsoft or Harvard University or Tufts had 13% of their positions unfilled, that would be a major problem. So we have to deal with that. I asked my team, how long have we had a staffing gap? We went back 20 years. We had a 9% staffing gap, 8% staffing gap. So we've had that gap for a while. It's got to be closed.
So then when is a gap not a gap?
Right. Well, we are actively reducing it. We hired well over attrition last year, like I said. I started working on Capitol Hill when I was 18 years old, and I worked for the chairman of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, a former Marine by the name of Jack Murtha, who also tried to give a lot of money to the State Department. And I will say over the last 25 years, every Secretary of Defense, every chairman of the Joint Chiefs has wanted to give the State Department more money for exactly the reason that Jim Mattis said. We ought to be focused on conflict prevention, because once you get into the conflict, it's much more dire, much more serious, much more expensive. So it's been hard to do that and hard to shift those funds over. And this is not about taking money away from the military. I would not be here but for the U.S. Air Force, and that's how I started my career. So grateful to that institution. But this is about understanding how we work and operate in the world. When I go to one of those 50 embassies or consulates, the first thing I do is have a country team meeting in the morning. When I go to that country team meeting, I don't actually know who people are, which agency they're from, until they start talking, unless they're wearing a uniform. We are fully integrated. So you have representatives from the military, you have our AID professionals, you have commerce, you have treasury, depending on how big the post is. And of course, you have State Department contingent. We are fully integrated. And I think about it in Djibouti, where we have 3,000 troops, but a huge and important diplomatic mission. In Sudan, we had a lot of military folks and a big diplomatic presence. I could go on and on around the world. Only in Washington, when you come back, is it that one person at that table gets a 7% increase to the budget, and the others at the table get a 7% cut. Now, that's why I have been arguing we are a national security agency, and that we should be treated as a national security agency. It doesn't mean we should militarize foreign policy or what we do, but we should be realistic that our people are everywhere we have troops. Our people are in very dangerous positions, doing very critical work. And our people are out trying to advance U.S. interests in critical ways. And so treat us and fund us like we do our other national security partners. I think that would make so much more sense. I've been arguing for a long time that we ought to submit a unified national security budget. You can break it up and it can be considered separately by the committees of jurisdiction, but think of us holistically. Don't think of us as these little kind of stovepipes that you can cut over here and add over here, because that's not how we operate in the world. We operate together. And so we have to do, I think, a better job explaining what we do. I think we have to do a better job explaining to the American people what we do. I think for too long, we were labeled as the kind of foreign aid agency that just goes out and gives money to bad governments. You mentioned a really important statistic about how much of the budget actually goes to the State Department. There's a very famous set of polling on this question. When you go ask the American people how much they think goes to foreign aid, they say, gosh, probably 20% goes to foreign aid and foreign assistance around the world. And then when you ask them the follow-up question, well, how much do you think should go to foreign aid and foreign assistance and our efforts around the world? And they say 10%. And they are shocked when you actually tell them that it's 1% of our budget. I would like to argue that for the 1% that we spend on State Department and our foreign assistance programming, that the American people get an incredible return. Safer, more secure, more prosperous. I will just tell you, just last year on our consular teams, helping Americans in crisis, helped 70,000 Americans that had some sort of emergency somewhere in the world. These are people being helped that is never going to reach the front page of any paper, but someone had some unfortunate set of things happen to them, and their first call was to the U.S. Embassy or to a consulate. 70,000 Americans were assisted, right? So I can go on and on about what we're doing to open up markets for companies or job creation, what we're trying to do to level the playing field to try to deal with new and emerging threats. But I think for that 1%, it's a pretty good investment. And I think the American people know that. I told you this story back in the green room back there. When our folks go back to their high schools, when they go back to a Rotary Club dinner, take your pick of anywhere in the country, it is overwhelming to see the positive response that they get. I think people really do appreciate what our folks are doing. We are not able to connect that up on the budget side the way I think we could and should.
Yeah, interesting. I'm sure you saw the piece in the Atlantic about the hostage taking and your team within there. It's Karstens, I forget his full name.
Roger.
But yeah, Roger Karstens. It's a great PR story for you because they make a very good case. First of all, Americans are taken hostage, and this team does an extraordinary job getting them back. And it's all diplomacy and networking, and they show how that last 3 to 5 feet, that really matters, and that's what diplomacy is about. But I think that story might help because they make this, the author of the piece, shame on me for not remembering who wrote it, but in any event, he makes the case that it's a nonpartisan issue. Everybody can get behind that indeed we want to bring Americans home when they're taken hostage. And so I think getting that out more and explaining exactly what the role is really important.
Well, I think, so that is a very high profile situation, but I also think, again, President and Secretary like to talk about foreign policy starts at home. And I think connecting those dots back for people, whether it's gas prices, whether it's supply chain, whether it's, again, are their children going to be safe when they study abroad? Is it just the ability to get a passport? Connecting up those dots for people, I think, is really important about why what we do helps them in their local communities. Now, some of the things we do, I can't necessarily draw a straight line. If there is a crisis, if we're helping the Rohingya refugees because tens of thousands could really be suffering, or there's 6 million people that have fled Sudan and we're helping them, I can't necessarily tell you that that's going to change your life, but I know that the American value set is also that if we can do something to help along with our partners, that we should. And I know that people feel good about that, and they want the U.S. to play that kind of leadership role. And so I also feel good about that work that we do and our partners at USAID that they do.
So I know that one of Secretary Blinken's initiatives is to modernize the State Department.
Yes.
People think of the State Department running around with BlackBerries. not smartphones, right? Working on Wang computers.
A lot of people miss the BlackBerry.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
so how is that going? And you talked about how you're thinking about different types of recruitment, different expertise and knowledge base,
Yeah.
maybe different degrees, people with different sorts of background coming in. I know that you bring people back in that have retired and then go. So how is the modernization going?
I think it's going well. The Secretary rolled out the vision for the State Department modernization effort in the fall of 21. We have 3 pathways to our modernization effort. And again, it takes into account that global picture that you described, that I described, but it also takes into account all this feedback we get from the workforce about what they need, what they're looking for. So we've got 3 pathways. We've got a critical missions pathway, a workforce pathway, and a technology and risk pathway. On the critical missions, it is addressing those changes that we've talked about. So we've got 5 or 6 new critical mission areas that we are super focused on. We have a new consolidated China house, which looks at our competition with China not bilaterally, but through a global lens and an all-of-government lens. We have new efforts on climate diplomacy. We have new efforts on multilateral diplomacy. Mm-hmm. We have new efforts on commercial diplomacy. We have a new global health bureau. Post-pandemic, I think people would say, you know, what are you doing to make sure we actually know how to solve this the next time? And we have a new cybersecurity bureau. So critical missions, incredibly important, not to add work for people, but to give people the skills and capability to deal with the issues that are now coming across their desk on a regular basis that did not come across their desk 5 or 6 years ago even. So now conversations about cryptocurrency and blockchain and critical minerals, mm-hmm. we have trained people who can talk and deal on these issues. The workforce reforms, foreign service incentive structure, civil service reform, diversity, equity, and inclusion, retaining the people that we want to retain. I have learned that some attrition is actually good, and we have a fairly low rate of attrition in the State Department. So a lot of professional development training and taking care of that locally employed staff, those 52,000 people. So a lot going on in the workforce bucket. And then technology and risk. I never thought I would be able to sit here and tell you that the State Department is leading on technology, given what you've said about our experience with BlackBerries, but we are the only federal agency to have an enterprise-wide strategy on artificial intelligence. We have a big pilot program with a couple thousand people in it today. We have embraced data analytics. We have huge data sets. So we are leaning in to technology, and we are trying to have a more kind of reasonable approach to risk. You can never be 100% certain about the places where we are especially, but our people want to be in city centers, engaged with populations, and so we are leaning into that. That is the core of our modernization agenda, which I could talk to you about for 2 hours, but I know we're going to open it up for questions. But I'm actually very excited about where we've come on modernizing the State Department. It's not something you do one time. Mm-hmm. It is something you have to continue to do to refresh what's happening. You say one final thing. You mentioned Colin Powell, and he gave this famous speech many years ago about how State Department personnel needed to have an internet connection at every desk, and this was, we needed to come out of the dark ages on technology. And he laid out a vision for modernizing the State Department. He gave that speech on September 10th, 2001. Mm-hmm. 24 hours later, the world changes, America changes, our approach to U.S. foreign policy changes for 10 or 15 or 20 years. We have to understand that whatever we are building, whatever we are modernizing, we have to have the ability to respond to the kinds of crises that exist in the world we live in today.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I think Mary is taking charge.
Yes.
So it's time for questions from the audience.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary Verma. I have one question to you about Mr. Robert Lighthizer, the previous trade representative of the Trump government. Is reported he will be picked up as the Secretary Treasury if Trump returns to the White House. According to Lighthizer, no trade is free, right? So he has two leverage to control Trump's trade policy. One is tariffs. The second is devalue the currency of the dollar. His strategic purpose is to sign another Plaza Accord in 1985 with China. My question is, do you think its purpose is plausible? And what kind of leverage will the new government use to realize this strategic purpose? Thank you.
I'm Daniel Dresner. I'm a professor at the Fletcher School and a colleague of Professor
example.
Toff's. I have a question. You talked, Secretary Verma, about professional development. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about this, because one of the things that's always struck me is one of the things we do at Fletcher is teach a fair number of military fellows that cycle through. And one of the differences between defense and state is that the uniformed services have a tremendous infrastructure of higher education institutions in which we have the war colleges, they'll go to civilian institutions, get higher degrees, and the expectation, the culture of the uniformed services is they will serve and then they will come back and go to school for a little bit to make sure that they sort of, manage to keep up their skills. While the State Department is the Foreign Service Institute, they don't have much more than that. And I'm wondering, are you thinking about how you can sort of potentially upgrade those capabilities?
Yeah. So maybe I'll take Dan's question first, and thank you for everything that you do and put out on Twitter and everywhere else. We read it and appreciate it. So look, professional development is hugely important, and I don't love the military comparisons, right? We've already talked about the $800 billion budget and the 3 million people and so it's, and again, having been a product of an Air Force judge advocate school, there's a Army judge advocate school, a Navy judge advocate school, right? And so it's just it's very, very different, but we should learn from it in terms of making sure our people are getting mid-career development training and management training. We do an excellent job at language training, right? If you want to be the best linguist in, take your pick of language wherever you're going, you could end up spending 2 years at the Foreign Service Institute before you go out, so you can speak whatever language you're going to do. Where we weren't doing as well was in the professional development, managing of people, complex project management, and that's what we're really focused on. So for the first time, again, a lot of credit to Secretary Powell and others, Secretary Clinton, who called for a training float. And Secretary Blinken has been really pushing this. We now have about 350 people that we have taken out of their kind of career pathways to go spend 1 or 2 years either at the War College or at Stanford or at Tufts. You're going to see more people actually coming your way to receive that kind of training, to get that kind of experience, and especially in those critical mission areas that we've talked about. So now also think about that staffing gap I talked about. Think about the reaction people have when you're taking 300 people out, when you haven't filled all your positions. But we think as we're decreasing the gap, we can afford to give people those skills that they need to really take that next level, and we have to incentivize it. We have to make sure that the people going to do these trainings know that it will be important to their career progression, and that is something we are working on quite aggressively. On the trade question, I will say the great thing about this job is I don't get to do politics, which is really cool. So I'll just say a little bit about how important the trade policy is to what we do and how closely we work with our friends at USTR and the work that they are doing and the work that we do in economic diplomacy. When I was ambassador in India, the amount of time we spent trying to build a kind of trade framework that never existed before, so that when there was a dispute, when you did have a problem, there was a mechanism and framework to resolve it. These are huge markets that are available to our companies and our people around the world, and I think that's what we have to continue to fight for. And it's a challenging time on the economic front. So I don't want to get into what might or might not happen. I just want you to know that one of our critical mission areas is actually commercial diplomacy and working hand in hand with our USTR friends, but also doing development different, right? And investment different. So we have a Development Finance Corporation. We have a Millennium Challenge Corporation. We have USAID showing up to compete with some of our adversaries on the economic side is super important. And I think we're showing up much better than we have in years past.
In centuries past, international relations concerned threats and opportunities, land, sea, air, and now we have to worry about cyber and space. Can you say just a couple of words about how the modern diplomat is dealing with threats and opportunities in cyber and in space?
Yeah, so I love that you asked that question. Thank you. Because we have a new cyber bureau, and they are doing some really cool things. So if I look at what the UN resolution on artificial intelligence, for example, I think had 135 countries. We were a big part of drafting and trying to get that through, so using AI for good. Basically, what they are trying to do is be out setting standards in a world that currently doesn't have a lot of standards. Let me give you an example, just on data privacy and data mobility, right? You can go from California to Europe to India to Brazil to everyone has a different regime. We still don't have a global standard on data privacy, right? That is something diplomats need to be working on. On uses of, again, artificial intelligence, on behavior when it comes to using technology for good. Look at some of the work that we've done with our Quad partners, for example. So we need to be out there setting the standard and helping set rules of the road so that technology can lift people up and empower people, not to surveil people and not to oppress people. And so we have very different visions about how technology should be used than our adversaries, how they're thinking about technology. So an incredibly important space for us. Leading to space diplomacy. I've spent a fair amount of time with our friends from NASA who are doing incredible work. But again, the rules of the road on space are fairly nascent. They're not as developed as they could be. We have many more commercial actors in space. We have space debris. We have environmental concerns. We have security and military concerns. We have to be out there, again, setting norms and rules of behavior so that space can be a domain that continues to be peaceful and used for exploration and science and discovery, and not for purposes that do not advance public safety or public well-being.
I'm Nathaniel Lord. I'm a force pathology student, and I have a question for Deputy Secretary. How do you and the State Department incorporate and prioritize natural resource conservation as an aspect of diplomacy, especially with the context of the climate crisis?
Hi, I'm Gideon Gordon. I'm a recent graduate of Boston University, IR. Secretary Verma, you mentioned at the outset something about not repeating the mistakes of the past. Can you give specific examples of what mistakes you don't intend to repeat and what the State Department has learned from them?
Sure. Well, I can address that one very, very quickly. I think, trying to dismantle the State Department, trying to cut its budget by 30%, having a global hiring freeze, shrinking the budget significantly, those would be significant mistakes that we should not repeat. There's a lot we could talk about there, but obviously, look, we are trying to advance a world with new forms of cooperation, new partners, traditional allies and alliances getting stronger. NATO has never been as strong as it is today. Our new partnerships in Asia, along with our treaty alliances, are so important to American safety and security. So we have to also do the things that we do well, but also do it in this new environment, giving people a voice who may not have had a voice in the past. And then, again, bucking up and trying to build up the department and not shrink it or cut it back dramatically. On natural resource conservation, we have a big bureau and a big effort that focuses on this. We have a Bureau of Oceans and the Environment that spends so much time trying to lead efforts on resource conservation. We have a climate team that was, up until a few months ago, led by Secretary Kerry, that is also trying to do the work on climate diplomacy and trying to stay within that kind of 1.5 degree kind of threshold on global warming. So there's a lot of work to be done on the diplomatic side. This is where our partnerships with industry are so important, our work with nonprofits, and we see the impact to the planet if we don't move aggressively. And so this has been a huge priority for the department and will continue to be. I don't know if you want to add anything on this.
No,
yeah.
I think it's fun.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Ed Martins, a longtime member of WorldBoston. I have a question. You talked about help building the budget of the State Department. I'm speaking now from personal experience. One thing the State Department used to be able to do was helping American businesses market their products overseas. They did sometimes would do it. Maybe I'm a little out of date on this, but I'm saying, again, it happened to me personally. Have you ever thought about going to the local chambers of commerce and showing how you can help them? Like, anyone with a brain can say, we've got a worldwide market now. And they can you can work with them together to get, believe me, the local congressional representative listens to the Chamber of Commerce. They've got their phone number.
Thank you.
So can you talk to them with that?
Mary Mendoza, longtime member of WorldBoston. You mentioned TPP, or actually you mentioned that there was a lot of stuff we got rid of under Trump. One of them was TPP. Are you making any plans to get that restarted or to work our way back into TPP so we can be a member of that huge partnership?
Okay, good. So on helping local businesses and small businesses, absolutely. I mean, I speak to chambers of commerce all the time. I speak to AmChams around the world. So yes, it is one of the first things that we do. We also want to stay in our lane and not tread on our Commerce Department colleagues. But again, when I go out to an embassy, particularly a big post, you generally have Commerce, Treasury, State, along with USAID, Development Finance Corporation, working hand in hand, right? Advancing US commercial interests. Now, let me add one other important point. When they used to ask me to go to a grand opening of a factory in India when I was ambassador, right, of a US company, I would say, that's interesting, I would like to do that. Tell me why this is good for American workers or American shareholders, because I want to know that story too. Because back to what the American people expect, I don't think they just expect us, yes, they want us to open markets, but they want to know that it has a payoff back in the United States. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania in a place called Johnstown that was, frankly, when we got there in the early 70s, the place was booming. Steel, coal, heavy industry, some start of technology. By the mid-'80s, we had been left behind, all in kind of in the name of globalization. So I am very cognizant, the Secretary is very cognizant, that as we do this work, we got to show that nexus back to kind of helping local economies, increasing job creation and investment. And I think the way the modern kind of trade system works, or the way the supply chains are so integrated now, it's not a win or lose. It's that you do facets of your operation in different countries. That is good for U.S. companies. So I could always make that argument. I just wanted to make sure people understood we have that as a real focus. On TPP, I don't think I'm going to make any news here about whether we are or not.
Big announcement?
You know, no, and in fact, that would be for my USTR colleagues anyway. But the notion of increasing our presence and our connectivity in the Indo-Pacific, in South America, absolutely important, and we're super focused on it. So I don't want to, again, I don't want to get too outside of my lane, but being on the field and engaged and in the key countries where commercial activity is happening, we absolutely need to be there and be there in a big way and show up strong.
Hi, my name is Matthew Wong. I'm a public affairs officer at the Consulate General of Canada in Boston. I'm here in a personal capacity, but two questions. You mentioned that there was a 13% gap at the State Department. Where exactly is that gap sort of focused? You know, is it in the consular services, the commercial, political affairs? And then the second question, which I sort of guess I have to ask, if you could comment on the U.S.-Canada relationship, even if you see any sort of, I guess, resources being taken away from that relationship being developed, or anything like that. Thank you.
I'm a recent grad. My name is Nabil, and I'm a recent graduate from Brandeis University. I have a question with. I feel like dissent is a very important part of a functioning democracy, and I do want to understand, like, how is dissent? You know, sort of, how does dissent happen in the State Department? And you talked about data points, and how does that dissent change between seasoned people who've been in the State Department for a while and newly inducted people? Thank you so much.
Just how do we deal with dissent?
I mean, how is dissent a regular part of conversations, and how does dissent become, like, it allows you to focus on things?
Got it, yeah. So let me just maybe I could take that one first. You know, I really, again, just so honored to work on the 7th floor of the State Department with an incredible group of leaders, and we hear a range of views every day, and I believe people feel empowered to come in and offer a range of different views, and we really debate things out, and it's welcomed, frankly. We also have a formal dissent process channel, which members of the department can use at any time and have used on a fairly regular basis, especially since October 7th, and that is incredibly respected. It's run by our friends at Policy Planning, and we take that quite seriously. So some of these issues are so hard, right? They don't have a clear-cut path, so you want that kind of really vigorous debate before you decide on a path forward, and we are, you know, again, lucky to be part of this incredible interagency group where on the really big decisions, you really do hash it out with our White House friends, with our Treasury and Defense Department friends and others. So dissent, differing views, contrary views are very, very important in the work that we do. U.S.-Canada relationship couldn't be stronger, I will say. Very happy about that. And in all honesty, when I think about the complexity of the relationship, the shared border that we have, the work that we are doing around the world together in so many different places, and we can still have disagreements, right? I say this all the time to friends in other countries where, you know, like, look at the U.S.-Canada relationship. We can have a fight on trade. We can have a fight on certain aspects on energy policy, and yet it would be hard to think of a friend and ally that is closer than Canada. Our staffing gap, it's one where I will, you know, probably not go into great detail on where that is. I will say it's scattered about. We, you know, some of our specialties on the foreign service side, political especially, we have a large cadre of people, but we are missing some people in the key function areas in the IT space. We're hiring aggressively in the consular space. So again, we're closing that, and it is shrinking, and so we are moving in the right direction.
Looking ahead, Monica, you, Dr. Toft, you prepare students right now for careers in the future. Many of them focused on representing United States interests in the international sphere. So how are you counseling students in this world of breakneck paced change? And then Secretary Verma, kind of the same question to you. I mean, you look for where the puck will be, not where it is right now. How are you counseling people who are getting going in their careers as diplomats?
Sure. It's a great question, and I do have some colleagues here. So I teach on demography and security, among other issues. And so when I teach that class to my students, I say, after you take this class, you're never going to be able to read the newspaper again, because the front page is going to have something that's demographically oriented. And what I love about demography is that you can project out, actually. It's not predictive, but the babies are born today, that in all likelihood, if you can get them past 1, especially the boys, past 10, chances are they're going to live a healthy life. And today, the kids that are born, they're going to live to 110, maybe even 120. And why that matters for my students is, as I say, my job prospects, I was going to probably have 5 to 8 jobs across my career. They're going to have 15 to 20, maybe even 30 different jobs. So they need to keep learning. And the world is moving at a breakneck pace. Technology, I can tell you, our students, that our technology policy program is exploding. Conflict resolution is always popular, but with the conflict, we had, the 90s was supposed to be the period of peace, love, and dope, right? Well, it was, but it didn't last very long, and here we are in a very scary world. I was a Cold Warrior, I was the US Army, it set me up for a beautiful career, I was a Russian linguist. I'm back in fashion again. That's a little unnerving for me, right? Like, my Russian's fashionable, really? And so what I say is keep learning. Like, come to us, we'll do our best. We're gonna try to teach you or help you to ask better questions, to be analytical. We can't necessarily teach you everything in terms of substance, but if we teach you how to ask the best questions and to challenge, be the person that asks the very difficult questions in the room, then you can make an extraordinary difference in the world. And what's great about the Fletcher School, and I think I can speak for my colleagues here, is our students do want to change the world. They're going to be global leaders. But in order to do that, they have to keep learning and moving into the future, because they're not going to be retiring at 65. Sorry, social security networks and people who administer those around the world. Macron is discovering he'd like for people to retire at 65, but they're not going to, and we don't need to. I think 80 is the new 60 and 60 is the new 30. I mean, it really is true. We're living longer, we're living healthier, and as a result of that, our students who are engaged with the world and interested in changing the world, they're going to have to keep learning and adapting in order to solve the trickiest, peskiest problems that we're facing.
That's a great answer. It made me very concerned. 120 makes me very...
As long as we keep our wits.
Yeah.
We know how to build all these parts, right? It's this. That's where we have to go.
So I can't say it any better than what you just said, really. I mean, what I tell young people who are thinking about a career in the Foreign Service or just in international affairs, right? You have to be curious about the world. You have to keep up with what's going on. But again, when I think about what we're looking for today, yeah, we need scientists. We need people that know space. We need people that know climate. We need people that have come from a medical background who can help us on pandemic response. So we need all kinds of people coming into the kind of practice of diplomacy. We have one of our diplomats in residence here in the front row who has a home at Tufts, but has 6 states that she's responsible for. Thank you for the work that you do. And I think the amount of interest, I know when students come talk to you, or people are really interested in playing some sort of role. The other thing I would just say is that diplomacy, as much as we want you to come to the State Department, diplomacy looks and takes place in a lot of different places. Mm-hmm. So you can be a really good diplomat in an international nonprofit. You can be a diplomat in a company, as an academic, as a volunteer. What we're talking about is trying to have an impact on people, to try to have a positive impact on what's going on in the world, and you can have that from a lot of different perches. What we need is commitment, we need expertise, we need curiosity, and I think that's how Americans are programmed, frankly. And so, again, I will end on this optimistic note that despite all these challenges, I really think so much of the world counts on us, not just at the Department of State or USAID, but counts on Americans to play an active, engaged, and inspired role in the world. And I believe that's what we're doing today, and I believe that's what we should be doing in the years ahead.
All right, commitment, expertise, and curiosity. Those are good words to keep in mind. Deputy Secretary Richard Verma and Dr. Monica Duffy-Toft, thank you so much for being with us at World Boston.